You need a $500,000 license just to open the door. Then, you need to survive a lawsuit that's already bankrupted clubs twice your size. This is the strip club business in America, one of the most misunderstood industries in hospitality and one of the hardest to actually run. Picture the pitch. A packed room, a full bar, a line out the door on a Friday night, a product that never goes out of style. No inventory, no supply chain, no seasons. Just doors open, music on, and cash rolling in every night of the week. Here's what that pitch leaves out. A liquor license that can cost more than some people's houses. A zoning map that legally confines you to a handful of parcels in the entire city. A wage and hour lawsuit that has already erased years of profit at some of the biggest chains in the country. And a tax structure so cash-heavy, the IRS treats you like a standing invitation to audit. By the end of this, you'll understand why these clubs look like gold mines on paper and why so many of them are one bad year from insolvency. This isn't one business, it's two, and state law is what splits them apart. In Texas, if you serve alcohol, dancers cannot perform fully nude. That's a hard line enforced by the state's alcohol regulator. So, you get topless clubs with a full liquor license where the bar carries the margins. And you get fully nude clubs that can't serve alcohol at all, running as bring-your-own-beer or juice bars, making their money almost entirely off cover charges and private room time. Most states draw this same line, somewhere. A few carve out narrow local exceptions, but they're the outlier, not the rule. So before you've spent $1, state law has already decided which of two very different businesses you're allowed to run. And the two make money in almost opposite ways. Here's where most people's assumptions collapse first. You can't open one of these clubs wherever you want. Adult use zoning ordinances, upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court under what's called the secondary effects doctrine, let cities restrict these businesses based on their impact on crime and property values, not their content. In practice, that means distance requirements, typically 500 to 1,500 feet from schools, churches, residential zones, parks, and often other adult businesses. Map that against any real city, and the legally available land shrinks to a handful of parcels, usually industrial lots near highways or airports, the only zones nobody fought to protect. That scarcity is the entire game. A club that's been operating for 20 years under a grandfathered permit is worth dramatically more than an identical building 2 blocks away that can no longer get a permit at all, because the zoning map has since been redrawn around it. You're not really buying a bar. You're buying one of a fixed, shrinking number of legal addresses in the metro area, and that's what shows up as value on the balance sheet, not the furniture inside. Then there's the liquor license. And this is where the topless, full bar model gets expensive. Fast. In states that cap the number of liquor licenses per county, a standard license might run a few $1,000s from the state. An adult-use liquor license on the secondary market, where existing holders sell to new buyers because the state isn't issuing new ones, can run anywhere from the low 6 figures to well over $500,000 in competitive counties. You're not paying for a piece of paper. You're paying for permission to exist inside a system built to keep that permission scarce.
Now add the build-out, a staged floor, sound and lighting systems, VIP room partitions built to code, commercial kitchen equipment if you're serving food, and security that goes well beyond a normal bar, cameras covering every square foot, reinforced entry points, and often off-duty police or licensed security for weekend shifts. A serious build-out in a leased space commonly runs into 7 figures once you include the license, the construction, and the security systems, before a single customer walks through the door. Liability insurance runs multiples of what a standard restaurant pays because insurers price in exactly the litigation history we're about to get into. There's one more line item almost nobody outside the industry knows exists. Several states impose what's informally called a poll tax, a per-customer surcharge on sexually oriented businesses. Texas charges $5 per customer, upheld by the Texas Supreme Court in 2011, with the revenue directed towards sexual assault prevention and healthcare programs. $5 sounds trivial, Multiply it across a packed venue every weekend, and it becomes a real recurring cost that a normal bar down the street simply doesn't carry, stacked on top of standard sales and alcohol tax.
Which brings us to the single biggest financial risk in this industry. It isn't robbery, it isn't a zoning fight, it's labor law. For decades, the standard model has been to treat every dancer as an independent contractor. She doesn't get a paycheck, she pays the club a house fee just to work her shift, then keeps what customers pay her directly: tips, dance fees, VIP room time. For the club, that's a huge advantage. No minimum wage, no overtime, no payroll tax, no workers' comp. Here's the problem. Federal courts have ruled against that model over and over for more than a decade. Class actions across the country have argued that dancers were misclassified, that clubs controlled their schedules, their appearance, their conduct, and their pricing closely enough that they were functionally employees, not independent contractors. In 2017, a Michigan federal judge approved a $6.5 million settlement covering roughly 28,000 dancers across dozens of clubs nationwide, after the chain that ran them was found to have misclassified performers as contractors for years. That's not a fine against one bad operator on the fringe of the industry. That's a judgment against one of the largest strip club operators in the country. An owner who treats the contractor model as a permanent, cost-saving feature of the business is one lawsuit away from a very different balance sheet. This is the risk that ends more of these businesses than a slow Friday ever will. So, why hasn't every club just switched to paying dancers as employees? Because that decision alone can flip a profitable year into a loss. And that tension is exactly where the rest of this business lives. If you're finding this useful, subscribe, because the next section is where this thesis actually gets tested against real numbers. Now, how the money actually moves once the doors are open. The cover charge at the door mostly offsets security costs rather than generating real profit. House fees paid by dancers to work a shift can add up to a meaningful 5 figures a month across a full roster. VIP and private room time, sold in blocks, is where the highest margin money in the building actually lives. And in the Topless, full liquor model, the bar itself can push alcohol margins similar to any high-volume nightclub, often 3 to 4 times cost on pour. Food, if offered, is typically a minor add-on, not a real profit center. Layer all of that together, and a well-located, well-run club in a major market can generate annual revenue anywhere from the high 6 figures for a smaller independent venue up into 8 figures for a large flagship location. The spread is enormous, and it comes down to 2 things: how scarce your license and location are, and how well your labor model is built to survive a legal challenge. Scale changes this business more than almost any other corner of hospitality. A single location owner carries the full weight of every cost above on one property with no leverage to negotiate insurance rates or absorb a single bad lawsuit. That's why real consolidation in this industry has happened at the corporate level. RCI Hospitality Holdings, one of the only publicly traded operators in the U.S., owns a portfolio of clubs alongside separate restaurant and sports bar brands, deliberately diversifying so litigation or a downturn in one location doesn't sink the whole company. A multi-location operator can spread legal costs, negotiate group insurance, standardize a contractor agreement that's already been tested in court, and absorb one bad settlement using cash flow from a dozen other locations. That's an advantage a single location owner simply doesn't have. Because the costs on the other side are relentless, regardless of scale: rent or debt service on a scarce zone property, payroll for bartenders, security, and management, who are almost always true employees, not contractors. Insurance priced for a high litigation industry. Marketing that has to work around advertising restrictions most businesses don't face. And cash handling controls, because a cash-intensive business with a tip-based, contractor-heavy workforce is exactly the profile that draws IRS attention. Get the cash controls wrong, and it doesn't just cost you money, it can put the license itself at risk.
And looming over every year of operation is the possibility of a wage and hour lawsuit that could erase several years of profit in a single settlement. Most traditional banks won't lend to this industry at all, regardless of how clean the books are. Adult entertainment sits on the restricted list at most major lenders and card processors, alongside cannabis and firearms in some states. A buyer can't just walk into a regional bank for a standard commercial loan. Instead, deals get financed through private lenders, seller financing, or specialty commercial lenders who understand the industry. And all three come at a cost. Interest rates routinely run several points above a standard commercial loan, and some private lenders want a larger equity stake or a shorter repayment window to compensate for the risk. That financing gap shapes almost every acquisition in this space, even though it's rarely mentioned in the same breath as the license or the zoning fight. Given all of that, the smarter operators have stopped gambling on the labor issue and started hedging it directly. Some clubs have converted dancers to W-2 employees with a base wage plus tips, borrowing the tip credit framework that already exists in restaurant labor law. It costs more upfront, payroll tax, minimum wage guarantees, workers' comp, but it closes off the single largest legal exposure in the business almost completely. Others have kept the contractor structure, but rewritten their agreements around recent court rulings, reduced how much control the club exercises over schedules and appearance, and now carry a dedicated litigation reserve as a standing, monthly line item, treating a future lawsuit as a cost of doing business, not a remote possibility. The clubs that get caught flat-footed are almost always the ones still running the same contractor paperwork their location used 20 years ago, never updated against the case law piling up against it. Here's what that actually looks like on a balance sheet. The Good Year, a mid-sized topless club in a major metro. Full liquor license and build-out financed over time. Gross revenue, $3.2 million, with bar and VIP room revenue carrying the bulk of it. Operating costs, rent, payroll, insurance, security, utilities, the per-customer surcharge, and debt service come to roughly $2.6 million. Net operating profit before taxes? Around $600,000. On paper, a genuinely attractive business. The Bad Year. A group of current and former dancers files a misclassification lawsuit. Legal defense alone runs several $100,000 before any settlement is reached. The case settles for $1.4 million, covering back wages for dozens of dancers over several years. That single event wipes out more than 2 years of the Good Year's profit, and it doesn't even count the legal fees, the reputational damage, or the fact that the entire labor model now has to be rebuilt from scratch. That's the gap this business actually runs on. Not a slow month of alcohol sales. One lawsuit, filed once, resolved years later for an amount that can erase the profit of the Good Years entirely. That's also the answer to the question from the top. The license and the location are what make these businesses look like gold mines on paper, and the labor model is what decides whether that value ever survives contact with a courtroom. So, is this the easy cash business people assume it is? No. It's a scarce license real estate business wrapped around a labor model that federal courts have been dismantling for over a decade, operating inside a regulatory system built specifically to make it hard to open and harder to expand. The clubs that survive long-term aren't the ones with the busiest Friday nights. They're the ones that treated the license and the location like the rare asset they actually are, and treated the labor structure like the biggest legal exposure in the business, because it is. If you want the next breakdown like this one, another industry that looks simple from the outside and isn't, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.